The deafening crack of timber breaking echoed through the Montana wilderness, drowning out Jessamine Taylor's scream as the world came crashing down around her. It was 1876, and what should have been a simple task of retrieving supplies from the old storage shed had turned into a nightmare when the rotting roof finally surrendered to years of harsh western winters. Jessamine had come west with dreams bigger than the Montana sky, determined to make something of herself beyond the restrictive confines of Boston society. At 23, she had inherited a modest parcel of land from a distant uncle land that included a dilapidated cabin, an even more dilapidated storage shed, and enough challenges to make most women turn tail and run. But not Jessamine. Never Jessamine. Now, pinned beneath a massive beam that had once supported the roof, she wondered if her stubborn determination would be the death of her. Dust choked her lungs as she tried to call for help, knowing full well that her nearest neighbor was miles away. The pressure on her legs grew more painful with each passing second, and panic began to set in as she realized the true gravity of her situation. "Hello? Is anybody there?" Her voice sounded small in the vast wilderness. The silence that answered her was suffocating. Jessamine closed her eyes, fighting against the tears that threatened to spill. She hadn't survived the arduous journey west just to die beneath a pile of rotting wood. She hadn't defied her family's expectations, learned to ride, shoot, and survive on her own, only to meet her end in such an ignoble fashion. With renewed determination, she tried to push against the beam. But it wouldn't budge. Pain shot through her legs, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. The weight was immense, far too heavy for her to move on her own. As the minutes passed, the reality of her situation became increasingly clear without help. She might not survive this. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her growing despair like a knife. At first, she thought she might be imagining it, a cruel trick of hope in her final moments. But the rhythm grew louder, more distinct. "Help!" she called out, her voice stronger now, fueled by a desperate hope. "I'm in here! Please help!" The hoofbeats stopped, and for one terrible moment Jessamine feared the rider had passed by. Then came the sound of boots hitting the ground, followed by hurried footsteps. "Hello? Is someone in there?" A deep voice, rough around the edges but unmistakably concerned, called out, "Yes, in the shed. I'm trapped." The remaining door to the shed was pushed open, flooding the dim space with late afternoon sunlight. Silhouetted against the golden glow stood a tall figure, broad-shouldered and imposing. As he stepped inside, features emerged from shadow, a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. Intense eyes squinting as they adjusted to the dimmer light, and a worn Stetson pushed back on his head. "Good Lord," he breathed, taking in the scene before him. "Don't move, I'll get you out." "Wasn't planning on dancing a jig?" Jessamine replied through gritted teeth, pain making her uncharacteristically sharp. The man's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile as he quickly assessed the situation. He moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to emergencies, kneeling beside her to examine the beam. "Name's Zachariah Stone," he said, his voice calm and steady as he tested the weight of the timber. "Most folks call me Zach." "Jessamine Taylor," she replied, watching his hands, strong, capable hands as they moved around the beam, testing its weight and position. "I prefer Jess." "Well, Miss Jess, you've gotten yourself into quite a predicament here." "I noticed." Despite the gravity of the situation, Zach's eyes flashed with amusement. "You're not from around these parts, are you?" "Boston," she admitted. "Though I've been in Montana territory for nearly 6 months now." Was all he said. But she could read the unspoken thought. 6 months wasn't nearly long enough to learn all the dangers the frontier posed. "I'm going to lift this beam," he explained, positioning himself beside her. "When I do, I need you to pull yourself out. Can you move your legs at all?" Jessamine tried, wincing at the pain that shot through them. "A little. I think they're just pinned, not broken." "Good, On the count of 3. He braced himself, muscles tensing visibly beneath his worn shirt. 1, 2, 3. With a grunt of effort, Zach heaved the massive timber upward. It rose just enough for Jessamine to drag herself free, every movement sending waves of pain through her battered limbs. The moment she cleared the beam, Zach's strength faltered. Rather than letting the timber crash back down, he maneuvered himself beneath it, taking the full weight across his shoulders and back as he carefully lowered it to the ground beside where Jessamine had been trapped. "You didn't have to," she began, but the words died on her lips as she saw him stagger slightly, the effort of what he'd just done evident in the trembling of his arms. "Couldn't risk it falling back on you," he said simply, straightening up and rolling his shoulders. "Are you hurt badly?" Jessamine assessed the damage. Her skirts were torn and filthy, her legs scraped and bruised, but nothing seemed broken. "I don't think so. Just banged up." Zach nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Let's get you out of here before the rest of this place decides to come down too." He extended a hand to help her up, and Jessamine took it, grateful for the support as she tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if not for Zach's quick reflexes. He caught her against his chest, one arm around her waist. "Sorry," she mumbled, embarrassed by her weakness. "Nothing to apologize for," he replied, his voice gentler than before. "Put your arm around my shoulders. I'll help you to my horse." They made their way slowly out of the shed, Jessamine leaning heavily against Zach's solid frame. Outside, a handsome bay gelding waited patiently, reins loosely ground-tied. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her property, painting the modest cabin and surrounding land in golden hues. "Is that your place?" Zach asked, nodding toward the cabin. Jessamine nodded. "Inherited it from my uncle. It's not much, but it's mine." Something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. "That's more than most can say." He helped her to the porch of her cabin, supporting her weight as if she were no heavier than a child. Jessamine couldn't help but notice the strength in him, the easy confidence with which he moved. Once she was seated on the rough-hewn bench outside her door, he stepped back, removing his hat and running a hand through dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than judgmental. "That shed isn't the only danger?" "I managed just fine," she replied, lifting her chin defiantly despite the fact that he'd just saved her life. Pride was sometimes all a woman had out here. Zach looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you do, Miss Taylor, but everyone needs help sometimes." He glanced up at the sky, noting the position of the sun. "It'll be dark soon. Do you have family nearby? Someone who can look in on you?" Jessamine shook her head. "No. No family. No neighbors close enough to matter." He frowned, clearly troubled by this information. "I can't in good conscience leave you alone in this condition. Mr. Stone, while I appreciate your concern, we've only just met, and—" "I'll sleep in the barn," he interrupted, anticipating her objection. "Or outside if you don't have a barn. I just want to make sure you can walk properly by morning and that nothing's broken that we can't see yet." Jessamine wanted to refuse his offer, to prove she didn't need looking after. But the throbbing pain in her legs and the genuine concern in his eyes made her reconsider. Pride wouldn't splint a broken bone or fetch water if she couldn't walk. "There's a small lean-to behind the cabin where I keep my mule," she conceded. "You're welcome to use it for the night." Zach nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll see to my horse, then check your legs for breaks." At her startled expression, he added, "I worked as a field medic during the war. I know what I'm doing." Before she could respond, he turned and went to retrieve his horse, leading the animal toward the lean-to. Jessamine watched him go, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought this man to her aid precisely when she needed him most. As the sun dipped lower toward the distant mountains, Casting the world in deepening shades of gold and amber, Jessamine found herself wondering who exactly Zachariah Stone was, and why he happened to be passing by her remote homestead at just the right moment to save her life. The pain in her legs momentarily forgotten, she watched as he tended to his horse with gentle efficiency, his movements speaking of years of experience in the saddle. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, in the watchful awareness of his surroundings that suggested he was more than just a passing cowhand. Jessamine had learned during her 6 months on the frontier that out here, everyone had a story, and few shared it willingly. Whatever Zachariah Stone's story was, she suspected it was more complicated than he let on. Zachariah Stone had been riding for 3 days straight, putting distance between himself and the trouble that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He hadn't planned on stopping until he reached the next town, but something about the small homestead had caught his attention. Perhaps it was the unnatural quiet, or maybe just instinct honed by years of surviving on his wits. Whatever it was, he thanked his lucky stars he'd listened to that inner voice when he found the woman trapped beneath the collapsed roof. Now, as he cared for his horse in the small lean-to behind her cabin, he wondered what a refined Boston woman was doing out here alone. Montana Territory was no place for the faint of heart, and while Miss Jessamine Taylor clearly had spirit, spirit alone wouldn't keep a person alive through the harsh winters and even harsher realities of frontier life. After ensuring his horse was comfortable, Zach gathered his medical supplies from his saddlebags. Simple things he'd carried since the war, a habit he couldn't seem to break even after all these years. He found a bucket, filled it with water from the nearby pump, and returned to the porch where Jessamine still sat, her face pale but composed. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her legs. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I suppose it would be foolish to refuse help now." Zach knelt before her and carefully examined her legs, his touch professional and impersonal despite the intimacy of the situation. Her skirts were modest, but he still had to push them up slightly to check for injuries, maintaining as much propriety as possible under the circumstances. "You're lucky," he announced after a thorough examination. "No breaks that I can tell. Bad bruising, some cuts that need cleaning, but nothing that won't heal with time and rest." "That's a relief," Jessamine said, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Zach cleaned her wounds with practiced efficiency, his hands gentle despite their weathered appearance. As he worked, Jessamine studied him more closely, the lines at the corners of his eyes suggesting both laughter and hardship, the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way he kept his body angled slightly so he could see the approach to the cabin even as he tended to her injuries. "You said you were a medic," she ventured. "During the war." He nodded without looking up from his task. "Union Army, 1863 to 65. "And after?" His hands paused momentarily before resuming their work. "A little of everything. Ranching mostly. Some other jobs when necessary." The vague answer only piqued her curiosity further, but Jessamine recognized the signs of a man who preferred not to elaborate. She'd met enough of them since coming west. "Well, I'm grateful you happened by when you did," she said instead. Zach finished bandaging a particularly nasty cut on her calf and looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "So am I." Something in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster, a warmth, a sincerity that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a physical thing. Zach was the first to break eye contact, clearing his throat as he gathered his supplies. "You should rest. Do you need help getting inside?" Jessamine tested her weight on her legs, wincing slightly but finding she could stand with support. "If you could just help me to the door, I can manage from there." He offered his arm, and she took it, leaning more heavily on him than she'd intended as they made their way inside the small cabin. The interior was modest, but meticulously kept a testament to Jessamine's determination to create a real home for herself in this wilderness. A small stove occupied one corner, a roughly made table and two chairs another. A curtain partitioned off what Zach assumed was her sleeping area. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked once she was seated at the table. "It's the least I can offer after what you did." Zach hesitated, aware that her supplies were likely limited. "Only if you were planning to cook anyway." "I was," she lied, and they both knew it, but neither acknowledged the falsehood. Despite her injuries, Jessamine insisted on preparing the meal herself, though she allowed Zach to help with the heavier tasks. They worked together in a companionable silence, moving around each other in the small space with surprising ease, as if they'd done this many times before. Over a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, Jessamine finally asked the question that had been on her mind since he arrived. "What brings you to this part of the territory, Mr. Stone? There's not much out this way." Zach took a sip of his coffee, considering his answer carefully. "I'm heading north. Thought I might find work at one of the bigger ranches up that way." It wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was more complicated, involving a poker game gone wrong in Butte and a man who'd sworn to put a bullet in him if he ever showed his face there again. But that wasn't the sort of thing you shared with a woman you'd just met, especially one who looked at you with eyes that seemed to see more than you wanted them to. "Well, the Mitchell place is always looking for good hands," Jessamine offered. "About 20 miles north of here." "I'll keep that in mind." As night settled fully over the small homestead, Zach excused himself to sleep in the lean-to, refusing Jessamine's offer to take the floor of the cabin despite the cooling temperatures outside. Some proprieties still needed to be observed, even in the wilderness. "I'll check on you in the morning," he promised as he left. "Don't try walking too much tonight if you can help it." "I'm not completely helpless, Mr. Stone," she reminded him, a hint of that earlier defiance returning to her voice. He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, less weathered by life. "I never thought you were, Miss Taylor." That night, as Jessamine lay in her small bed, she found herself listening for sounds from outside, comforted by the knowledge that she wasn't alone on her isolated homestead. There was something reassuring about Zachariah Stone's presence, something that made her feel safer than she had in months. She told herself it was simply gratitude for his timely rescue, nothing more. But as sleep finally claimed her, her last conscious thought was of the gentle strength in his hands as he tended her wounds, and the unexpected warmth in his eyes when he smiled. Outside in the lean-to, Zach settled his bedroll near the entrance where he could keep an eye on both the cabin and the approach. His Winchester rifle lay within easy reach, a habit born of necessity in a land where danger could come from any direction, at any time. He hadn't planned on stopping, hadn't planned on getting involved in anyone else's troubles when he had plenty of his own. Yet here he was, watching over a stubborn Boston woman who had no business trying to make it alone in this harsh country. The smart thing would be to check on her in the morning and then continue on his way, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Butte. But as Zach drifted toward sleep, he found himself thinking not of the troubles behind him, but of the quiet determination in Jessamine Taylor's eyes, and the way she'd refused to let pain or fear break her spirit. There was something about her that intrigued him. Something that made him wonder if perhaps fate had led him to her door for a reason beyond a simple rescue. Morning arrived with a clarity unique to the Montana mountains, the air crisp and clean, the sunlight brilliant against the deep blue sky. Zach woke before dawn, a lifetime of early rising ingrained too deeply to break the habit now. He checked on his horse, splashed cold water from the pump on his face, and was just considering whether to knock on Jessamine's door when it opened. She stood framed in the doorway, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She moved gingerly, clearly still in pain, but she was standing on her own. Good morning, she called, a tentative smile on her face. I was hoping you might help me with the fire. My legs aren't quite cooperating yet. Zach crossed the yard in long strides, relieved to see her up but concerned by the pallor beneath her freckles. You should be resting. I've rested enough, she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. Besides, chores won't do themselves. The cabin was cool in the early morning, and Zach quickly set about building a fire in the small stove while Jessamine prepared coffee. They moved around each other with the same easy rhythm as the night before, as if they'd been doing this dance for years rather than hours. How are the legs this morning? He asked as they sat down to a breakfast of leftover cornbread and the last of Jessamine's preserves. Stiff. Painful, she admitted. But I've had worse. Zach raised an eyebrow at that but didn't press for details. Everyone had their stories out here, their private battles and scars. If she wanted to share hers, she would. I should check those bandages before I go, he said instead. Jessamine looked up sharply. You're leaving today? He hadn't actually decided until that moment, but the logical part of him knew he should. Staying in one place too long was dangerous for him and potentially for anyone around him. Yet something made him hesitate. Something in the way she looked at him, in the quiet strength she exhibited despite her injuries. I should, he said slowly. But I'm thinking maybe I won't. Not today, at least. He gestured toward the window where the collapsed shed was visible. That needs to be cleared away before it becomes an even bigger hazard. And you shouldn't be doing heavy lifting with those injuries. Relief flickered across Jessamine's face before she composed herself. I wouldn't want to keep you from your journey north. The Mitchell place isn't going anywhere, he replied with a slight shrug. And it seems to me you could use the help, just for a day or two until you're back on your feet properly. Jessamine hesitated, pride warring with practicality. I can't pay you, she finally said. Not much, anyway. I'm not asking for payment, Miss Taylor. Then why? It was a fair question, one Zach wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why risk staying? Why help this woman he barely knew? Perhaps it was simply that he'd spent so many years looking out for himself that helping someone else felt like a welcome change. Let's just say I've been on the receiving end of kindness from strangers before, he replied. Seems right to pass it along when I can. Jessamine studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning in his words. Finally, she nodded. All right then. I accept your help, Mr. Stone. For a day or two. Zach, he corrected. If I'm staying, you might as well call me Zach. Jess, she countered with the hint of a smile. No one calls me Jessamine except my father when he's cross with me. After breakfast, Zach helped Jess outside to a chair he positioned on the porch, where she could rest in the sunshine while directing him toward the tasks that most needed attention. Despite her injuries, she was reluctant to sit idle, insisting on mending a pair of trousers while he worked. Zach began by clearing away the collapsed shed, salvaging what lumber he could, and setting aside the pieces that might still be useful. As he worked, he occasionally glanced toward the porch, where Jess sat with her needle flashing in the sunlight, her auburn hair catching fire in the morning light. There was something undeniably appealing about her, a quiet determination that spoke to something inside him. By midday, he'd cleared most of the debris and stacked the salvageable wood near the cabin. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat, as he approached the porch for a drink of water. You've done more in a morning than I could have in a week, Jess admitted, pouring him a cup from the pitcher beside her. It's what needed doing, he said simply, accepting the water gratefully. The support beams were rotted through. It's no wonder it collapsed. I knew it wasn't safe, she sighed. I just hadn't gotten around to dealing with it yet. Too many other things needing attention. Zach leaned against the porch railing, studying the property with a critical eye. It's a lot for one person to manage, especially someone not raised to this life. Are you saying I can't handle it because I'm from Boston? Jess asked, a dangerous edge to her voice. I'm saying it's a lot for anyone to handle alone, he clarified, meeting her gaze steadily. Man or woman, Eastern or Western born. That's why most homesteaders come out as families or join existing communities. The fight went out of her at that, her shoulders slumping slightly. Well, I don't have a family to bring, and the nearest community didn't exactly welcome a woman alone with open arms. There was a story there, one Zach suspected involved the kind of small-minded prejudice that festered in isolated communities. He'd seen it before, the suspicion toward outsiders, the particular wariness reserved for women who didn't fit the expected mold. Their loss, he said simply. Jess looked up, surprised by his response. Most men would say I was foolish to try this alone. Most men haven't seen what I've seen, he replied. Sometimes being alone is the only choice that makes sense. Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding, of recognition. Jess nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. Well, Mr. Stone, Zach, she corrected herself. I'm grateful for the help. However long you choose to stay. Let's see what else needs doing before the day's out, he suggested, finishing his water and returning to work. The afternoon passed in much the same way, Zach working methodically through the most pressing repairs while Jess rested and recovered, offering direction and occasionally company when he took breaks. By evening, he'd reinforced a sagging corner of the cabin, repaired the loose step on the porch, and even managed to patch a leak in the roof that had been troubling her for weeks. Over another simple meal, they found themselves talking more freely, sharing the kinds of stories that strangers exchange to become less strange to one another. Jess told him about her decision to leave Boston after her mother's death, how the suffocating expectations of society and her father's plans to arrange a suitable marriage had pushed her to seek out the inheritance left by her mother's brother, a man she'd never met, but who had apparently understood the value of independence better than anyone else in her family. They all thought I'd be back within a month, she admitted, a hint of triumph in her voice. Father gave me exactly that long before he said he'd wash his hands of me entirely. And yet here you are, 6 months later, Zach observed. Here I am, she agreed, though I admit there have been moments when I questioned my own sanity. Such as when buildings collapse on you? Jess laughed, the sound bright and genuine. That would be one of those moments, yes. In return, Zach shared carefully edited stories of his travels since the war, working cattle drives in Texas, spending a winter with a Blackfoot tribe in the Northern Territories, a brief stint as a deputy in a Colorado mining town. He omitted the parts that involved gunfights, bounties, and the kind of trouble that had sent him riding north in such a hurry, but he gave her enough to satisfy her curiosity without revealing too much. As night fell once again, Zach found himself reluctant to leave the warmth of the cabin for the lean-to, though he knew he must. There was something about Jess Taylor that drew him in a combination of strength and vulnerability, determination and doubt that resonated with his own complicated nature. I should check your bandages before I go, he said as he helped clear the table. Jess nodded, sitting back down and carefully raising her skirt just enough to expose the bandages on her lower legs. Zach knelt before her, his touch professional as he unwrapped the cloth to examine the wounds beneath. Healing well, he pronounced, relief evident in his voice. No signs of infection. You were lucky. I was lucky you came along when you did, she corrected him softly. Zach looked up, finding her eyes on him with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the silence between them charged with something neither was prepared to name. I'm glad I did, he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. He finished rebandaging her legs and stood, gathering his hat from the hook by the door. I'll see you in the morning. Jess nodded, her cheeks slightly flushed. Good night, Zach. Good night, Jess. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the vast sky like diamonds on black velvet. Zach made his way to the lean-to, his mind troubled by thoughts he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. He'd made it a rule not to get attached to people, to places, to anything that couldn't be quickly abandoned if trouble found him. And yet, after just 2 days, he found himself drawn to this isolated homestead and the remarkable woman trying to make a life there. He told himself it was simply admiration for her courage, respect for her determination to forge her own path. He told himself he'd move on soon, continue north as planned. He told himself many things as he settled into his bedroll, but the image that followed him into sleep was of auburn hair catching fire in the sunlight, and blue eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed defenses. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, clouds building in the west that promised rain by afternoon. Zach woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Jess limping slowly across the yard, a pot in hand. "You shouldn't be walking that much yet," he called, rising quickly to meet her. "And you shouldn't have to drink the coffee you make?" she retorted with a smile. "I've tasted it, remember?" He took the pot from her hands, noting with approval that she looked better this morning. Her color improved, her movements pained but steadier. "How are the legs?" "Better. Stiff, but better." They shared breakfast in the lean-to, sitting on upturned crates as they watched the storm clouds gather. Zach found himself enjoying the simple companionship, the easy conversation that flowed between them as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. "I should finish what I can before that rain hits," he said eventually, glancing at the darkening sky. The fence on the north side looked ready to fall over. Jess nodded, her expression turning serious. "I appreciate all you've done, Zach, truly. But I don't want you to feel obligated to stay beyond today. You've already done more than I could have asked." There it was, the opening, the permission to leave that he should have been grateful for. And yet, Zach found himself strangely reluctant to take it. "Let's see where we stand after I fix that fence," he replied noncommittally. The morning passed quickly as Zach worked on the sagging fence, replacing rotted posts and mending broken rails while Jess sat nearby, strong enough now to venture further from the cabin. She worked on mending harness leather as he worked on the fence, their conversation flowing easily between them. "How did you learn to do all this?" she asked, watching as he expertly notched a rail to fit into the post. "Necessity," he answered simply. "When you move around as much as I have, you pick up skills along the way." "And why do you move around so much?" The question was innocently asked, but it cut close to truth Zach preferred not to examine too closely. He paused in his work, considering how much to reveal. "Some men aren't meant to put down roots," he finally said. "I learned that a long time ago." Jess studied him. Her head tilted slightly to one side. "I don't believe that," she said after a moment. "I think everyone is meant to put down roots somewhere. Some just take longer to find the right soil." Zach looked up, surprised by her insight and the gentle way she challenged his long-held belief. Before he could respond, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, quickly turning into a steady downpour. They gathered their things and ran for the cabin, Jess moving more slowly due to her injuries. By the time they reached the porch, they were both soaked through, laughing breathlessly as they stumbled inside. "That came on faster than I expected," Zach said, removing his dripping hat and hanging it by the door. Jess pushed wet strands of hair from her face, her dress clinging to her in a way that made Zach quickly avert his eyes. "Montana weather," she said with a shrug. "Unpredictable at best." She moved to the stove, adding wood to build up the fire while Zach remained awkwardly by the door, water pooling at his feet. "You should change," she said, glancing back at him. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." "I'll be fine," he insisted, though he was already beginning to shiver slightly in the cool air of the cabin. Jess gave him a look that brooked no argument. "Don't be stubborn. I have some of my uncle's old things in the trunk over there. They might be a bit short in the arms and legs, but they'll be dry at least. Zach hesitated, but the sensible part of him knew she was right. He retrieved the clothes, a faded flannel shirt and wool trousers that had seen better days, and stepped behind the privacy screen she indicated. As he changed, he could hear Jess moving about the cabin, the soft sounds of her own movement suggesting she too was changing out of her wet clothes. The intimacy of the situation wasn't lost on him, both of them changing in the same small space, separated only by a screen and the proprieties they both still observed, despite the circumstances. When he emerged, dressed in the too short but blessedly dry clothes, Jess was already by the stove, her wet hair braided and hanging down her back, wearing a simple house dress of deep green. She glanced up as he approached, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Those were my uncle's finest trousers," she teased, noting the way they ended well above his ankles. "I'll try not to ruin their fine appearance," he replied dryly, which only made her smile widen. Outside, the rain continued to fall in sheets, drumming on the roof and turning the yard into a sea of mud. It was clear they were confined to the cabin for the remainder of the day, a reality that brought with it a strange mixture of anticipation and unease for them both. They passed the afternoon in quiet conversation, Jess teaching Zach to play a card game her uncle had apparently been fond of, while the storm raged outside. As evening approached, the rain showed no signs of abating, and they prepared a simple meal together, working in the easy rhythm they'd established over the past days. "Do you think it will stop by morning?" Jess asked as they sat down to eat, the cabin now warm and filled with the savory smell of the stew they'd prepared. "Hard to say," Zach replied, looking toward the window where water streamed down the glass. "These mountain storms can last a day, or a week." Jess nodded, a shadow passing across her face. "I suppose you'll want to be on your way as soon as it clears." The statement hung between them, neither quite a question nor an assumption, but something in between, an acknowledgement that whatever this was between them had a natural endpoint. Zach found himself at a crossroads. The sensible thing, the thing he'd always done before, would be to agree, to thank her for her hospitality and move on as planned. But something held him back, some reluctance to step back into the solitary life he'd lived for so long. "Actually," he said slowly, "I was thinking I might stay on a bit longer, if you'd be willing. There's still plenty that needs doing around here, and winter's coming faster than you might realize." Hope flickered in Jess's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "I wouldn't want to delay your plans." "My plans aren't exactly set in stone," he admitted. "And like I said before, the Mitchell place isn't going anywhere." For a long moment, Jess simply looked at him, as if trying to discern his true motives. Finally, she nodded. "I'd be grateful for the help, especially with winter coming. But I insist on some arrangement for payment. Perhaps a share of whatever we manage to harvest before the snow, and meals in the meantime." Zach recognized the offer for what it was, a way for her to accept his help, without feeling beholden to him, a preservation of her independence even as she acknowledged her need for assistance. "That seems fair," he agreed, extending his hand across the table. Jess took it, her smaller hand warm in his. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Stone." "We do indeed, Miss Taylor." They fell into a routine over the next days that felt surprisingly comfortable, as if they'd been sharing this life for months rather than just over a week. The rain continued intermittently, sometimes easing enough for Zach to complete outdoor repairs, sometimes forcing them inside where they worked on indoor tasks or simply talked, learning more about each other with each passing day. Zach discovered that Jess had a quick mind and a thirst for knowledge that had made her something of an oddity in Boston society. She'd studied subjects considered inappropriate for young ladies: mathematics, natural sciences, even some medicine under the tutelage of a sympathetic family doctor. That knowledge had served her well on the frontier, where practical skills were valued above social graces. In turn, he shared more of his own past growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, joining the Union Army more out of a desire to see the world than any particular political conviction, and finding himself forever changed by what he witnessed on the battlefields. He still kept certain parts of his life after the war to himself, but he found himself sharing more with Jess than he had with anyone in years. As the days turned into weeks, Zach found himself thinking less and less about moving on. The work was hard but satisfying, repairing fences, reinforcing the cabin against the coming winter, hunting to supplement their dwindling supplies. And in the evenings, there was Jess, her quick wit, her surprising resilience, and the way she looked at him sometimes when she thought he wouldn't notice. A look that suggested she was coming to care for him as more than just a helpful stranger. It was a dangerous path they were treading, and Zach knew it. The sensible thing would be to leave before either of them became too attached. Before the past he'd been running from caught up with him and put her in danger too. And yet, each morning found him still there, finding new reasons to stay just one more day. The first snow of the season caught them by surprise, falling heavily overnight and transforming the world into a glistening white landscape by morning. Zach woke in the lean-to to find his breath frosting in the air and a thick blanket of white covering everything in sight. He'd managed to make the small structure more comfortable over the weeks, adding walls of salvaged lumber and a makeshift stove that provided enough heat to keep from freezing. Still, on mornings like this, the temptation to seek the warmth of the cabin and its occupant was strong. Bundling up against the cold, he made his way through the snow to the cabin, noting with approval that the repairs they'd made to the roof seemed to be holding. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting Jess was already up and about. He knocked lightly before entering, a courtesy they maintained despite the growing familiarity between them. Jess looked up from the stove where she was preparing breakfast, her face lighting up at the sight of him in a way that made his heart skip a beat. "You look half frozen," she observed, gesturing for him to come closer to the fire. "I was just about to bring you some coffee." "You shouldn't be trudging through the snow," he replied, stomping his boots to clear them of snow. "Your legs still bother you in the cold." It was true, though, her injuries had healed remarkably well. She still limped slightly on particularly cold mornings, a reminder of their first meeting that neither of them was likely to forget. "I'm not made of glass, Zach," she reminded him, though her smile took any sting from the words. They ate breakfast together, discussing the work that needed to be done despite the snow. Winter had arrived earlier than expected, and there were still preparations to be made if they were to survive comfortably until spring. "The lean-to won't be warm enough once the real cold sets in," Jess said, broaching a subject they'd both been avoiding. "You should move into the cabin." Zach looked up sharply. "That wouldn't be proper." "Proper?" Jess laughed, though there was a nervous edge to the sound. "I'm a woman living alone with a man who's not my husband. I think we left proper behind a long time ago, at least by society standards." She had a point, but still Zach hesitated. Moving into the cabin would cross a line they'd carefully maintained, a final barrier between their growing feelings and the reality of acting on them. "I could hang a curtain," Jess continued when he didn't respond. "You could have the space near the stove, and I'd keep my area behind the partition. It would be perfectly respectable." Perfectly respectable, perhaps, but also a constant temptation. Zach wasn't sure he trusted himself to maintain that respectability with Jess sleeping just feet away, separated only by a thin curtain. And yet, she was right about the lean-to. Even with his improvements, it wouldn't be enough once the deep cold of January and February set in. And if he was honest with himself, the idea of spending the long winter evenings in the warmth of the cabin, with Jess for company, was far more appealing than the solitude of the lean-to. "All right," he finally agreed, "but only until the worst of winter passes." The satisfaction in Jess's smile suggested she knew she'd won more than just this argument. "Of course. only until spring. They spent the day preparing for Zach's move, rearranging furniture and hanging a sturdy curtain across one corner of the main room to create a private space for him. Jess insisted he take the area near the stove, knowing it would be warmer there, while she maintained her sleeping area behind the existing partition. As they worked, Zach found himself increasingly aware of the implications of their new arrangement. They were creating a shared life, however temporary they might claim it to be. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified him, stirring feelings he'd kept carefully buried for years. That evening, as they sat before the fire after a simple but satisfying meal, Jess finally asked the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "What are you running from, Zach?" He looked up, startled by the directness of her query. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" "The way you check the horizon every morning," she said softly. "The way you position yourself to see the door no matter where you're sitting. The fact that in all our conversations, you've never once mentioned planning to go back anywhere, only forward. Always forward." Zach was silent for a long moment, staring into the dancing flames. Jess waited patiently, giving him the space to decide how much or how little to reveal. "I got into a disagreement with a man in Butte," he finally said, his voice low. "The kind that doesn't end well for either party." "A gunfight?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. He nodded, still not looking at her. "He drew first. I was faster." "Did you kill him?" "No," Zach replied, meeting her gaze at last. "But I hurt him badly enough that his friends swore they'd find me. He was an important man in town, or at least, he had important friends." "And so you left," Jess concluded. "I left," he confirmed. "It seemed the wisest course. I've found that trouble has a way of finding me if I stay in one place too long." Jess considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they're still looking for you?" "Men like that don't forget easily," Zach said with a shrug that aimed for nonchalance but missed. "But Montana's a big territory. The chances of them finding me here are slim." "Unless someone recognized you and sent word," she pointed out, ever practical. "Unless that," he agreed. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. Zach waited for what he assumed would come next. Fear, perhaps, or a polite suggestion that he might want to continue his journey after all, now that she knew the potential danger his presence brought. Instead, Jess reached across the space between them and laid her hand on his. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Surprised, Zach turned his hand over, capturing hers in a gentle grip. "You're not afraid?" "Of what?" "That some men from Butte might come looking for you?" She shook her head. "I've faced worse dangers than that since coming west." "You haven't," he said, more sharply than he intended. "Men like that, they don't care who gets hurt as long as they get what they want." "Then it's a good thing I have you here," she replied, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "A fast gun might come in handy." Zach didn't return her smile. "This isn't a joke, Jess. If they found me here, you could be in danger too. Maybe I should." "If you say leave, I'll be very cross with you, Zachariah Stone," she interrupted, her grip on his hand tightening. "We're partners now, remember? Whatever comes, we'll face it together." There was such certainty in her voice, such unwavering faith, that Zach found himself momentarily speechless. How had this happened? How had this remarkable woman come to trust him so completely in such a short time? "You hardly know me," he said finally. "I know enough," she replied simply. "I know you risked your life to save a stranger. I know you've worked alongside me for weeks, asking for little in return. I know you're a good man, whatever mistakes you've made in your past." Her words warmed something inside him that had been cold for too long. Without thinking, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "What did I do to deserve you?" Jessamine Taylor. She blushed at the gesture but didn't pull away. You showed up when I needed you most, she answered, her voice slightly breathless. And you stayed when you could have gone. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Zach knew he should release her hand, maintain the careful distance they'd established, but he found himself unable to let go, drawn to her in a way he hadn't been drawn to anyone in years. It was Jess who finally broke the spell, gently withdrawing her hand and rising from her chair. It's getting late. We should both get some rest. Zach nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her retreat, even as a part of him longed to pull her back. Good night, Jess. Good night, Zach. As they retired to their respective sides of the curtain, Zach lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft sounds of Jess settling into bed just feet away. She knew the truth now, or at least part of it, and still she wanted him to stay. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying, a responsibility he wasn't sure he deserved, but found himself desperately wanting to live up to. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white and sealing them together in their small cabin as winter settled in around them. The weeks that followed brought them closer in ways neither had anticipated. Confined to the cabin by frequent snowstorms, they found themselves learning the rhythms of shared domestic life, cooking together, reading aloud from Jess's small collection of books, playing cards or simply talking as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. They were careful to maintain certain boundaries. The curtain remained firmly in place, and they were scrupulous about giving each other privacy for dressing and bathing. But in every other way, they were living as a married couple might, sharing responsibilities and small daily intimacies that gradually wove their lives together. During breaks in the weather, Zach would hunt or check his trap lines, bringing back game to supplement their dwindling supplies. Jess turned her hand to preserving what he brought, smoking meat and rendering fat with the skill of someone who had learned quickly what survival on the frontier required. December gave way to January, and still they remained in their comfortable routine, neither mentioning Zach's original plan to move on or the growing feelings between them that became harder to ignore with each passing day. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard in late January that their careful arrangement was tested. The wind howled through every tiny crack in the cabin walls, and despite the roaring fire, the temperature inside had dropped dangerously. Zach woke in the night to find himself shivering beneath his blankets, his breath visible in the dim light cast by the banked fire. Concerned for Jess, he rose quietly and added wood to the stove, building up the fire in hopes of warming the cabin. As he worked, he heard a soft sound from behind the partition, a muffled cough, followed by what sounded like chattering teeth. "Jess?" he called softly. "Are you all right?" Fine," came her reply, though the tremor in her voice belied her words. "Just a bit sea-cold." Zach hesitated only briefly before crossing to her partition and pulling the curtain aside just enough to see her. Jess lay huddled beneath every blanket she possessed, her face pale in the dim light, her body shaking with cold. "You're freezing," he said, concern overriding propriety. "It's just the D draft from that window," she insisted. "The one we see couldn't properly seal." Without further deliberation, Zach gathered her blankets and all into his arms. She was too cold to protest as he carried her to his own bed near the stove and laid her gently down. "What are you doing?" she managed through chattering teeth. "Keeping you from freezing to death," he replied matter-of-factly, tucking the blankets around her before adding his own. "It's warmer here by the fire." He turned to stoke the flames higher, but Jess's hand on his arm stopped him. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please, you're warm." Zach knew he should refuse, should maintain the careful distance they'd established. But the pleading in her eyes and the genuine danger of the cold made the decision for him. With only a moment's hesitation, he slipped under the blankets beside her, careful to keep a respectable space between them. Jess had other ideas. As soon as he settled, she moved closer, seeking his warmth. "I'm sorry," she murmured, "but I'm so sea-cold." "It's all right," he assured her, cautiously wrapping an arm around her to share his body heat. "Just for warmth." She nodded against his chest, her shivering gradually subsiding as they lay together in the dim light, the howl of the wind outside making their shelter seem all the more precious. Zach told himself this was merely practical, a necessity to prevent frostbite, or worse. But as Jess's breathing evened out and she drifted into sleep in his arms, he knew he was lying to himself. There was nothing merely practical about the way his heart raced at her proximity, or the way he found himself memorizing the feel of her against him, the subtle scent of her hair, the perfect way she fit in the circle of his arms. Morning found them still entwined, Jess's head resting on his shoulder, her hand splayed across his chest. Zach woke first, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight against him before remembering the events of the night. He should move. He knew restore the proper distance between them before Jess woke and found them in this compromising position. But before he could extricate himself, Jess stirred, her eyes fluttering open to meet his. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the usual barriers between them temporarily suspended in the intimate cocoon of morning. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice soft and still rough with sleep. "Morning," he replied, acutely aware of everywhere they touched. "How are you feeling?" "Warm," she answered with a small smile. "Thanks to you." Neither made any move to separate, the moment stretching between them with new possibilities. Zach knew he should be the one to pull away, to re-establish the boundaries they'd so carefully maintained, but with Jess looking up at him with those clear blue eyes, her lips so close he could feel her breath against his skin, all thoughts of propriety seemed very distant indeed. "Jess," he began, not entirely sure what he intended to say. She saved him from having to decide by reaching up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with a gentleness that made his heart ache. "I know we've been careful," she said quietly. "I know there are 100 reasons why this is complicated, but I'm tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in the morning light. Zach covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. "I've been running for so long," he confessed, "from my past, from attachments, from anything that might make it harder to leave at a moment's notice. But these past months with you, I find myself wanting to stop running." Hope bloomed in Jess's eyes, transforming her face. "Then stop," she whispered. "Stay here, with me." The simplicity of her invitation belied the complexity of what she was offering: a home, a partnership, a future together. It was everything Zach had convinced himself he couldn't have, shouldn't want. And yet, looking into her eyes, he found it increasingly difficult to remember why. "It won't be easy," he warned. "My past could still find us. And I'm not exactly husband material." Jess smiled at that. "I'm hardly typical wife material myself. Perhaps that's why we suit each other so well." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, questioning kiss that quickly deepened as Zach responded with all the longing he'd kept carefully restrained for weeks. When they finally parted, both breathless, Zach rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure about this? About me?" "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied without hesitation. "Are you sure about me?" Instead of answering with words, Zach kissed her again, pouring into the gesture all the feelings he'd struggled to express. Jess responded in kind, her arms wrapping around his neck as they lost themselves in the moment they'd both been moving toward since that first day when he'd found her trapped beneath the fallen timber. The blizzard raged on outside, but inside the small cabin, they found warmth in each other that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the stove. The remainder of winter passed in a haze of newfound intimacy and shared dreams. They talked of marriage in the spring, of expanding the homestead, of building a life together that neither had imagined possible just months before. The lean-to became a storage space once more, Zach's place now permanently beside Jess in the bed they shared, no curtain between them. They were practical enough to know that challenges lay ahead. Zach still checked the horizon each morning, still positioned himself to see the door, still kept his rifle within reach. But with each passing week without sign of trouble, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps his past had finally stopped chasing him. Jess, for her part, wrote to her father in Boston, informing him of her intention to marry. Whether he would respond with blessing or condemnation remained to be seen, but she found she cared less about his approval than she once might have. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her partner. Nothing else seemed to matter quite as much. March arrived with the first tentative signs of spring longer days, occasional thaws that revealed patches of muddy ground beneath the snow, the return of birds long absent during the coldest months. With the improving weather came increased activity repairs to winter damage, preparations for planting, plans for a small addition to the cabin that would give them more room for the future they both envisioned. It was during one such day of work that their peaceful existence was shattered. Zach was replacing a section of fence damaged by snow when he heard the distant sound of approaching riders. His hand immediately went to the pistol at his hip, a habit he'd never quite abandoned despite the months of peace. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the homestead, their figures clear against the bright blue sky. They paused there, as if surveying the property, before beginning a slow descent toward the cabin. Zach dropped his tools and ran toward the house, calling for Jess. She emerged from the chicken coop, a basket of eggs in her hands, her expression changing from curiosity to concern as she saw his face. "Get inside," he ordered, his voice tense. "Lock the door and get my rifle." "Who is it?" she asked, already moving toward the cabin. "I don't know yet, but they're coming this way, and they stopped to look things over first. That's not usually a friendly sign." Jess nodded, her face pale but composed as she hurried inside. Zach positioned himself on the porch, one hand resting casually near his gun as he watched the riders approach. As they drew nearer, his suspicions were confirmed. He recognized one of the men as a friend of the gambler he'd wounded in Butte. "Stay inside," he called to Jess, who had returned with his Winchester. "No matter what happens." She handed him the rifle through the partially opened door. "Be careful," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear but her voice steady. The riders drew up about 20 yards from the porch, spreading out slightly in a formation that spoke of experience with confrontations. The man Zach recognized, a hard-faced individual with a scar running from eye to jaw, spurred his horse forward a few steps. "Zachariah Stone," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Fancy meeting you here. Long way from Butte." "Not far enough, apparently," Zach replied, his tone deliberately casual though his body was tensed for action. "What brings you gentlemen to these parts?" "I think you know," the scarred man responded. "James Carson sends his regards. Says he's still got a bullet with your name on it." "Carson's welcome to try delivering it himself," Zach said. "Though I notice he didn't make the trip." The man smirked. "Still recovering from your last meeting, but he paid us well to find you and bring you back. Dead or alive, he wasn't particular." Zach assessed the situation with the calm detachment of someone who'd faced similar odds before. 3 against 1 weren't great odds, but they weren't impossible either. The problem was, Jess, if shooting started, a stray bullet could find her all too easily in the flimsy cabin. "I'm not going back to Butte," he stated flatly, "and I've started a new life here. Carson should find something better to do with his time than nurse old grudges. $500 is a powerful motivator, The man replied with a shrug. Nothing personal. The tension stretched between them, the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind him, Zach could sense Jess's presence, though he'd told her to stay inside. He knew without looking that she'd be holding the shotgun they kept by the door, ready to defend their home if necessary. "I'm giving you boys a chance to ride away," Zach said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Take a message back to Carson. Tell him I'm done running. This is my home now, and if he wants me, he'll have to come himself." The scarred man laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That's not how this works, Stone. You're coming with us, one way or another." Zach's hand tensed near his gun, calculating the odds, considering options. He could likely take one or two of them, but probably not all three, before someone got off a shot that might hit Jess. Before he could decide on a course of action, the cabin door opened fully behind him, and Jess stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held with surprising confidence in her hands. "My husband asked you to leave," she said, her voice ringing clear in the tense silence. "This is our land, and you're trespassing." The scarred man's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, then narrowed as he assessed this new element in the equation. "Didn't know you'd taken a wife, Stone. Complicates things." "Simplifies them from where I'm standing," Zach replied, drawing strength from Jess's presence beside him. "I've got more reason than ever to stay put and defend what's mine." A silent communication seemed to pass between the three riders, some unspoken calculation of risk versus reward. The odds had shifted with Jess's appearance. Now they faced not just one determined man, but a couple defending their home, both armed and clearly prepared to use those arms if necessary. "Carson's not going to be happy," the scarred man finally said. "Carson's happiness isn't my concern," Zach replied. "My wife and our future, that's what matters to me now." Another long moment of tension, and then, surprisingly, the scarred man nodded. $500 is good money," he said, "but not worth dying over, especially not when the odds have evened out." He turned his horse, gesturing for his companions to do the same. "I'll tell Carson we couldn't find you," he called over his shoulder, "but I can't promise he won't send others." "If he does, they'll get the same reception," Zach assured him. They watched as the three riders made their way back up the ridge, disappearing over the top and out of sight. Only when they were completely gone did Zach allow himself to relax slightly, turning to Jess with a mixture of pride and concern. "I told you to stay inside," he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice. "And I decided that wasn't the wisest course of action," she replied, setting the shotgun aside and moving into his arms. "Besides, you called me your wife. I couldn't very well let you face them alone after that." Zach held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair as relief washed over him. "I should have asked properly before using the term." Jess pulled back slightly to look up at him, a smile playing around her lips despite the tension of the past minutes. "Are you asking now?" "I am," he confirmed, suddenly dropping to one knee before her. "Jessamine Taylor, will you marry me? Properly, officially, for all the world to know?" Her answer was in her eyes even before she spoke the word. "Yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in the nearest town, a simple ceremony attended by the few neighbors they'd come to know over the winter months. Jess wore a dress of pale blue that matched her eyes, adorned with wildflowers she'd gathered that morning. Zach wore the one good suit he owned, purchased for the occasion, and likely to be worn only for special events thereafter. As they exchanged vows beneath the plain wooden cross, Zach found himself marveling at the strange twists of fate that had led him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a man with no home, no attachments, no future beyond the next town or the next job. Now he stood promising forever to a woman who had changed everything, whose strength and courage had given him a reason to stop running. "I, Zachariah, take you, Jessamine, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. As he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Jess's eyes shone with unshed tears of joy. When it was her turn to speak, her voice rang clear with certainty. I, Jessamine, take you, Zachariah, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Zach kissed his bride as the small gathering applauded. It wasn't the grand society wedding Jess might have had in Boston, nor was it the solitary existence Zach had resigned himself to after years of wandering. It was something better than either a beginning crafted from mutual respect, shared hardship, and a love that had grown from the most unexpected of circumstances. As they rode back to their homestead that evening, now truly husband and wife in the eyes of the law as well as their own, Zach found himself thinking of that first day of timber falling and a woman's desperate call for help, of the split-second decision that had changed both their lives forever. "What are you thinking about?" Jess asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "The day we met," he replied honestly. "How close I came to riding past your place without stopping." Jess reached across to take his hand, her new ring catching the light of the setting sun. "But you didn't. You heard me calling, and you came." "Best decision I ever made," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Even better than marrying me?" she teased. Zach laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to echo across the open landscape. "Well, they're connected, aren't they? If I hadn't stopped that day, I wouldn't have met you. If I hadn't met you, I'd still be running from place to place, never finding home. And I might be dead beneath that timber," she added more soberly. "Or rescued by some other passing stranger," he suggested. "Someone younger, handsomer, with fewer complications." Jess shook her head firmly. "No, it had to be you, Zach. I believe that with all my heart. Of all the men who might have passed by that day, fate sent me the one who would not only save my life, but show me what living really means." They crested the final hill before their homestead came into view, their home, their future, the life they were building together. Spring had fully arrived now, painting the landscape in shades of green and gold, the promise of new beginnings written in every budding tree and sprouting field. "Look," Jess said softly, pointing to where the old storage shed had once stood. In its place was the frame of a new building, sturdy and strong, built by Zach's hands with help from neighbors during the weeks leading up to their wedding. "It's really taking shape. It'll be finished before winter," he promised. "A proper barn this time, not some rickety shed that collapses at the first heavy snow." "I'm rather fond of that rickety old shed," she replied with a smile. "Without it, we might never have met." Zach laughed again, the sound of a man truly at peace. "In that case, perhaps we should build a memorial instead. Here once stood the shed that brought Zachariah Stone to his senses and his wife." "A fine epitaph," Jess agreed, her eyes dancing with amusement, "though I suspect our grandchildren might find it puzzling." "Grandchildren, is it?" Zach raised an eyebrow. "Moving rather quickly, aren't we, Mrs. Stone?" The new name made her smile widen. "Well, first children, of course, but I do plan for the long-term husband." The word sent a thrill through him even now, hours after the ceremony. Husband. He was someone's husband. He belonged somewhere, to someone, in a way he'd never expected to again after the war. "I like the sound of that," he admitted. "Children running around the homestead, learning to ride and shoot and build things that don't collapse. And read and write and appreciate the finer things as well," Jess added. They'll have the best of both our worlds. As they approached their cabin, their home, Zach marveled at how different it looked from that first day. The sagging porch had been repaired, the roof reinforced. The walls chinked against winter drafts. Flowers Jess had planted were beginning to bloom along the walkway, and the vegetable garden they'd prepared together showed the first green shoots of what would be their summer harvest. It wasn't a grand estate. It would never compare to the society mansions of Boston, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, a testament to their determination and shared vision. Zach dismounted first, then reached up to help Jess down from her horse. But instead of setting her on her feet, he held her in his arms, her skirt spilling over his forearms as she laughed in surprise. "What are you doing?" "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he explained, mounting the steps to the porch. "Isn't that the tradition?" "I believe it is," she agreed, her arms around his neck, her face alight with happiness. "Though I don't recall you being such a stickler for tradition before." "I'm making an exception," he said, pushing open the door and carrying her inside. "For important occasions." He set her down gently in the middle of their cabin, the space that had been his salvation through the winter. The home they'd created together. The beginning of all that was to come. Jess looked around, taking in the simple decorations she'd arranged for their return: wildflowers in mason jars, candles waiting to be lit, a bottle of wine given as a wedding gift by a neighbor. It wasn't elaborate, but it was perfect, a celebration as authentic as the love they shared. "Welcome home, Mr. Stone," she said softly, turning to face him. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," he replied, drawing her into his arms. As the last light of day faded into dusk, they closed the door on the world outside, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, whatever challenges they might face, they would face them together. Just as they had that first fateful day when timber fell and a life was saved, a connection forged in danger and cemented in love. 5 years later, the homestead was barely recognizable as the struggling operation Jess had been trying to maintain alone. The cabin had been expanded to a proper house with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a sitting room where books lined shelves Zach had built by hand. The barn stood solid and impressive where the collapsed shed had once been, housing not just Jess's mule, but 3 good horses, a milk cow, and enough storage for hay to last the winter. Fields that had once been overgrown now produced wheat, corn, and vegetables in abundance. Fruit trees Jess had insisted on planting despite Zach's skepticism about their hardiness had surprised everyone by thriving and were beginning to bear. A creek that ran along the edge of their property had been partially diverted to create a more reliable irrigation system, Zach's engineering skills from the war finding peaceful application in their growing enterprise. But the most significant changes weren't to the land or buildings, but to the people who called the place home. Zach stood on the porch, watching as Jess moved through the garden, their 3-year-old son toddling along behind her with a small watering can that spilled more than it delivered to the plants. Little Jacob, named for Jess's grandfather, had his mother's blue eyes and his father's determined chin, a combination that promised both charm and stubbornness in equal measure. From the cradle inside came the occasional cry of their newest addition, Emma, just 6 months old, and already showing signs of being as strong-willed as her brother. Zach smiled at the sound, still amazed that he, who had once avoided attachments of any kind, now found his greatest joy in the family he and Jess had created. The letter that had arrived that morning lay on the table beside him, news from Boston that Jess's father had finally relented in his disapproval of her marriage and wished to meet his grandchildren. It had been a long road to reconciliation, with many letters exchanged over the years, gradually softening the old man's stance as he read of his daughter's happiness and success. They would go east in the fall, Zach decided, after the harvest was in. It would be good for the children to know their grandfather, to understand that part of their heritage as well as the frontier spirit that had shaped their early years. And it would be good for Jess to make peace with the family she'd left behind, though she insisted she had no regrets about her choices. As for Zach, he found himself curiously untroubled by the prospect of visiting Boston society. 5 years ago, he would have refused outright, convinced that his rough ways and complicated past would only embarrass Jess among her former peers. But time and love had changed him, given him a confidence that came not from bravado, but from knowing exactly who he was and what mattered most to him. James Carson and his threats were a distant memory now. Word had reached them 2 years ago that Carson had died in a barroom brawl, taking any lingering danger with him to the grave. Zach still checked the horizon occasionally, an old habit too ingrained to break entirely, but he no longer slept with his gun beside the bed or started at unexpected sounds. He was at peace with his past, with himself, with the life he'd built from the ashes of the war and the wandering years that followed. And at the center of that peace was Jess, who had seen something in him worth saving long before he recognized it in himself. As if sensing his thoughts, Jess looked up from the garden and smiled, the same smile that had first captured his heart in the aftermath of disaster. She said something to Jacob, who immediately abandoned his watering can and ran toward the porch, arms outstretched. "Papa! Papa! Mama says it's story time." Zach scooped the boy up, settling him on his hip with practiced ease. "Is that so? And what story shall we have today?" "The one about the falling timber," Jacob declared, as he always did. It was his favorite tale, the story of how his parents met, though told in simplified terms appropriate for young ears. Again? Zach pretended exasperation, though in truth he never tired of recounting that day. "Don't you want to hear about the time I outran a buffalo instead?" Jacob shook his head emphatically. "No, I want the one where you saved Mama and the timber nearly squished you flat." "Nearly squished me flat, did it?" Zach laughed, carrying the boy inside to check on Emma, who had fallen silent. "I don't recall that part." "That's how Mama tells it," Jacob insisted. "She says you were the bravest man she ever saw." "Does she now?" Zach found Emma awake but content in her cradle, her tiny fists waving in the air as she spotted her father and brother. He shifted Jacob to one arm so he could gently lift Emma with the other, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit in the crook of his elbow. "Well, your mama might be exaggerating just a bit. I wasn't nearly as brave as she was, living out here all alone before I came along." Jess appeared in the doorway, earth from the garden still on her hands, her hair escaping from its practical braid. To Zach, she had never looked more beautiful than she did in these moments of everyday life, vital, strong, completely herself. "Are you telling tales on me, Zachariah Stone?" she asked, her voice warm with affection. "Just setting the record straight for our son," he replied. "He seems to be under the impression that I performed some great feat of heroism the day we met." Jess crossed the room to join them, laying a hand on Zach's arm as she smiled down at Emma. "And didn't you? I seem to recall a certain cowboy who dragged a foolish Boston woman out from under a collapsing building and took the weight himself rather than let it crush her." "When you put it that way, I do sound rather impressive," Zach conceded with a grin. "Perhaps I should let you tell the story after all." "Perhaps you should," she agreed, taking Emma from his arms. "But first, I believe someone promised to finish weeding the vegetable patch before dinner." Zach groaned theatrically, much to Jacob's delight. "Slave driver," he accused without heat. "Provider," she corrected, leaning up to kiss him briefly. "Of food, shelter, and the occasional adventure involving falling timber." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he assured her, setting Jacob down. "Come on, young man. You can help me with those weeds, and I'll tell you the story while we work." As they headed back outside, Jacob's small hand tucked trustingly in his, Zach reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought him to this point. From the battlefields of the Civil War to the lonely years of wandering, from a chance encounter on a remote homestead to the family and future he'd never dared to dream possible. He had stopped running, just as Jess had asked him to do that snowy morning years ago. And in stopping, in putting down roots in this place with this remarkable woman, he had found not the danger or constraint he'd feared, but freedom, the freedom to love, to build, to become the man he was always meant to be. Behind them, Jess began to sing softly to Emma, her voice carrying on the afternoon breeze a lullaby Zach had come to know well over the years of their marriage, a sweet, simple melody that spoke of home and belonging. Jacob tugged at his hand, impatient for the story he'd been promised. "Tell it, Papa. Tell about the day you met Mama." Zach smiled down at his son, seeing in the boy's eager face echoes of both himself and Jess, the best of them both, carried forward into a future bright with possibility. "Well," he began, as they knelt together in the rich earth of the garden, "it was a day much like this one, bright and clear, with the kind of sky that makes you believe anything is possible." And as he recounted once more the tale of timber falling and lives changing, of rescue and renewal, of love found in the most unexpected of circumstances, Zachariah Stone knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, not passing through, not running away, but home at last, home forever.